I simply can't respond because I have no idea what evidence they're referring to. Globalization has caused discrimination. I'd have thought it was the opposite. I'd have thought that...
No, for instance, they singled out workers in third world economic processing zones. Again, part of a prescription, may not be IMF prescription, but certainly part of a global prescription, in which it said these workers were prey for exploitation, and because unemployment, for instance, they mentioned Indonesia, had been forced down by the so-called economic crisis of the late 90s, their human rights were lost.
No, Indonesia grew as a result of integrating into the global economy from the 60s on, and incomes in Indonesia rose. It was a dictatorship. Some of their rights were suppressed, and it was a very bad dictatorship.
Excuse me, Mr. Fisher, as you say, some of their rights were repressed. A third of the population of East Timor died or were killed under the Soeharto regime.
What are you asking me that question for? Do you think we supported the Soeharto regime? Well, don't be ridiculous.
Well, did you speak out against it? Did your institution, the IMF, speak out? The World Bank didn't. The first time after 30-odd years in there, the first time they spoke out was 1998. What did the IMF say about it?
When the IMF went into Indonesia, it insisted on a removal of a host of corrupt practices that began to weaken that regime. It was not an intended consequence, but it was intended that we went in and helped remove the corrupt practices in a variety of monopoly areas.
And because now the government, as recommended by the IMF, has already cutting off a lot of subsidies, not only oil and electricity, but also water and education and subsidies and agriculture. So it means that the workers, if they have sons or daughters, they have to pay more if they want to put their children to school. Before, of course, people eat 3 meals a day, but now they have to also make efficiency. So they eat, instead of 3, they eat twice a day, and or they reduce the quality of the food. So that's why maybe the level of productivity is getting lower, because people are getting poor and getting tired, and if you are tired you cannot work properly.
You know capitalism is a very law. It says it don't count unless it sells. When it costs too much to build it at home, you just build it cheaper someplace else.
2 years ago, thousands of protesters from all over the world converged on the American city of Seattle, where the World Trade Organization was meeting. This was news because it happened in America. And yet throughout the world, in Africa, Latin America, Asia, a deeper movement against globalization has been growing for years, but this is not considered news. On every continent, millions of ordinary people have protested against the power of the IMF and the World Bank and the imposition of Western power. People have marched and petitioned against privatization, against selling off their water, against turning their farms into suppliers for the dinner tables of the rich. Now the protests have spread to Western countries, from Seattle to Melbourne, London to Genoa. The coverage of these events follows a pattern. It seems it's only news when there's violence, even when the great majority of the protesters are peaceful. In contrast, the violence of the economic policies they are protesting about is seldom news. In the weeks and days leading up to May Day in London, the police and the government orchestrated a propaganda campaign. The aim clearly was to alienate the public from the demonstrators by representing them collectively as violent and by suppressing the very issues that have public support.
The limits of tolerance are passed when protesters, in the name of some spurious cause, seek to inflict fear, terror, violence and criminal damage on our people and property.
To Tony Blair, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is a spurious cause. When May Day came, 6,000 police turned part of London's West End into a giant detention camp.
I think the issue of violence, which we're constantly asked about, is our main way in. I think that the key to these things is actually getting mass amounts of people involved, because the media will put one point of view across time and time again, you know, the mindless hooligan side. But when you think about the mass redundancies, the poverty, the starvation, the literal raping of a country through third world debt and what have you, that is violence on a huge scale. It's genocide.
The newest ruler of the world is the World Trade Organization based in Geneva. The Economist magazine calls it an embryo world government, and yet no one has voted for it. The effect of its policies make it illegal for governments to hinder the profits of big business. This is known as free trade.
If there's one feature about the global economy, it's the companies have globalized. But we haven't regulated the global companies. And that's the change that we've got to put into this international system if we're ever going to get rules that are fairer to workers, fairer to the world's poor, fairer to all of those who are affected by this international production system.
People can't stand by, they can't be spectators when we're faced with forces like this. They join this movement and the movement starts to gather momentum. Already we've had some extraordinary successes. We managed to stop the implementation of a crazy idea called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which would have allowed corporations to sue governments for the removal of any law which they didn't like. Now that was being promoted, that idea, by the 29 most powerful countries on earth. It was being promoted by all the major multinational corporations and all the big institutions such as the World Trade Organization. And a ragged band of dissenters around the world managed to stop it. We beat them. And if we can beat that, we can beat anything.
What is with the people is the fact that the corporations and the superpower are using more and more fabricated propaganda. People can now see through the spin. People know they cannot believe anymore what is said. And the people are starting to withdraw their support. They're starting to say, no, a government that only protects the Pepsi and the Coke and the McDonald's is not our government.